Our next steps to space.
This time we go back to the moon to learn to live, to work, to invent, to create.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're in hour number 2, this live broadcast. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Thank you for rejoining us here. And again, the top story trumps all headlines today, which is why we're allocating a lot of focus and energy to this. U.S. officials saying here, telling CBS News that Iran is ready to strike multiple targets within Israel in the next 24 to 48 hours. Again, this timeline that they're citing here, it's flexible depending on what goes on the diplomatic front. We'll see. There's a lot of activity, I would imagine, going on behind the scenes to give us a little bit of insight on what might be going on behind the scenes, as well as comment on a number of other stories which we had slated for today. I want to welcome onto the program independent State Department correspondent and journalist Sam Husseini is joining us on the live link right now from the United States. Sam, welcome to the program.
Trick.
So things have developed. They're developing quite quickly on this front, Sam, and a lot of people are very concerned, very worried about escalation. Will people be able to control this escalation? A lot of people are also concerned that Israel might have an incentive to draw the United States into a direct confrontation with the Islamic Republic of Iran. These are all concerns that a lot of people have right now. I know you've got your ear to the ground on this. Where is Washington right now on this issue? What are the main concerns? Are there people in place that can avert the worst possible scenario that we're thinking of here? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to say because, U.S. stated goals and actual goals aren't the same. They say they want stability and so on, but they end up, putting forward a series of policies that end up doing the exact opposite of what they say that they want. And this happens over and over again. There are a number of benefits of even putting out a false story of an escalation. It draws attention away from the actual carnage continuing to go on in Gaza. There's obviously concerted effort underway to make it, to frame it as a low intensity warfare conflict at this point. That is basically to normalize a genocide that's continuing to be perpetrated. So Israel has a number of interests in terms of, acting as though it's the victim, acting as though Iran might strike it directly. And the U.S. might share those interests. That doesn't preclude the possibility that Iran could actually do that. It's obviously been provoked. Most recently with a strike in Syria on its official diplomatic assemblies there. So I'm a little reluctant to get drawn into what's actually going on, because we're literally sort of being spun by anticipation in large part coming out of Washington, which may or may not have, actual basis. I mean, you got to be reminded of, Washington was claiming that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, and a lot of people said, "Oh no, that's not going to happen," because Washington is lying 110% of the time, and Washington does lie a hell of a lot of the time. But in that particular case, that did actually happen. So I think those are some of the parameters to keep in mind here.
Yeah, I think you're right. The big point there, I think the big important point that you've made is Israel, through this provocation by hitting the Iranian embassy in Damascus just last week, by doing this and creating this new escalation ladder, they've totally taken the focus off of Gaza. And as you said, Sammy, the horrific crimes against humanity, the genocide that's been taking place over the last 6 months, that's all too convenient, a very canny move on Israel's part, but also potentially a very risky move if they're not able to manage the fallout on this. So in terms of the appetite for war right now, let's just talk about this real quick, Sam. Election cycle, Biden administration. Is a war with Iran good or bad for a Biden re-election campaign? Good or bad for a Trump challenge? What are your thoughts on the political dynamics here?
I mean, in perverse ways, it's probably good for both. If you're, an incumbent, a sitting president, and you're in a war, that usually helps your numbers. The perverse logic in U.S. politics the last couple of decades. I don't think that used to be the case. In Vietnam, it actually hurt LBJ. So it partially depends on the level of protest against it. And you have seen substantial protests against it, and you've seen the Biden administration at least pretend to care about Palestinian civilians in large part, presumably because of concerns about domestic and election ramifications from parts of the Democratic Party as well as others. Trump seemingly has continuously, chopped at the bit against Iran. He pulled the plug on the Iran deal, which the Biden administration never put back. So, as I've long argued, there's effectively a complicity, a collusion going on between the Biden and Trump administrations in terms of core actual policies. This would be an incredible boon if there were a serious, credible candidate who was anti-war, but unfortunately that doesn't yet exist. RFK Jr. talks out of every side of his mouth, and Jill Stein has run for the presidency several times and not been able to crack low single digits. So part of what's driving this is the inability of anti-establishment forces in the United States, and I have my Vote Pact project, which is advocating this, to fix that, to have an anti-establishment candidate, getting support from both the left and right against war, against infringements on civil liberties, and so on. That's the solution that's sitting there that forces have not been able to organize around in the United States in order to help stave off this perverse dynamic that happens with the two-party duopoly, where they, in effect, log roll their way potentially into a wider war here.
Sure. And I know, breaking news just on the two-party duopoly. Your thesis there is absolutely proven by the renewal of the FISA warrant bill. So warrantless wiretapping on Americans extended. I mean, if you need any better example of both parties absolutely in the tank for all the wrong reasons, there you go. That thing could have been killed by anybody, but they've decided to keep it going, right. Sam. Unbelievable.
Right. And one or both of the parties go before their bases, tell them that they're going to fix a problem like that they're going to, drain the swamp, that they're going to stand up to the deep state. And then they turn around and they get an alleged briefing, as the Speaker of the House allegedly did, and then he pretends that they've got actual evidence or something. So I'm going to renege on all of this. And here we go again. Civil liberties get flushed down the toilet again, while we're facing an alleged imminent attack against Israel by Iran. How convenient. So a hell of a lot to be skeptical of, and every reason for people to finally break out of the corrupt duopoly.
So you were talking about there the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and that he was given this national security briefing from a SCIF, a special enclosed facility where lawmakers are given top secret briefings from the great and the good from the intelligence services. And a lot of people will say, Sam, I don't know if you agree or not, but it's very easy for intelligence operatives to show what they are, reports are maybe that might be true, might not be true, or it's something they piece together, and to shock and to scare the lawmaker, in this case, into renewing an unconstitutional piece of legislation. I mean, that's what Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute is saying, and others are saying this as well. But the mainstream media, Sam, they're saying, no, what the CIA show you in a SCIF is sacrosanct. it must be true. The ticking bomb, the Jack Bauer 24, the ticking bomb, the things we need to do to get that information. We really need to suspend all these rights and obstacles to, stopping the bad guys, right? What do you know about this? Is this possible that the deep state could be, kind of manipulating the process here in this case?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible that the deep state could be manipulating the process and could be feeding lawmakers fake or deceitful information. I don't know a great deal about it in exactly this context, but it's analogous to the context when you talk about the ticking time bomb and the Jack Bauer thing. The rationale for torture is similar. We got to torture people in order to get this information. And then the liberal response to that is torture doesn't work. The reality is that torture works to produce false but useful information. And that was done during the buildup of the Iraq War when they tortured people, or they had the Egyptians torture a person named al-Libi into saying that Iraq and al-Qaeda were working together. And then Colin Powell goes before the UN and saying, we know that al-Qaeda and Iraq are working together. So the CIA effectively lined up false but useful a false confession, effectively, in order to justify the policies. So you could very well be seeing an analogous situation here in terms of justifying mass surveillance.
So right now, let's go shift gears a little bit, unless you want to close up or have any further comments on this potential escalation now between. Oh, by the way, I'm just going to ask you if Iran does hit targets inside Israel, will there be, how much pressure will be placed on the Biden administration by the hawks from both parties that they need to retaliate against Iran? That the U.S. must stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. And at that point, is that a dangerous kind of road to tread down? Or do you think that the Joint Chiefs at that more, say, tactical level that have war gamed out an exchange with Iran and seen it to be a losing endeavor in the end, talking about the Rand Corporation and others, that might show restraint in that case? How do you think Washington will behave if Iran does come good on what it says it's going to do? What do you think?
I'm not a military expert in terms of the war gaming. You would expect then the Iranians would close the Straits of Hormuz, and things could then Hezbollah would escalate their activities presumably. So there's a lot of different dimensions to this, but ultimately, if you really want to war game this out to the max, we're talking about the fact that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal and Iran doesn't. And the United States refuses to acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal. Netanyahu, that could be part of what's driving Netanyahu to seem to be, what's euphemistically called, provocative or aggressive and seeming to want a wider war, that ultimately he's got this ace in the hole if it totally goes to that. It is important to bear that in mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope that there's more reasons for the U.S. to put pressure on Israel to show restraint than there are for the other way around. I personally think that the U.S. military is in a very weak position, not as strong as it has been in the past in the Middle East. Therefore, they would be tremendously exposed should things escalate past that level. And I don't think that's something that Washington wants to think about managing at this particular time. That's just me being optimistic there, and that might include the Biden administration making a phone call to Tel Aviv on this. And certainly it seems like there's a little bit of friction between Joe Biden and Netanyahu, or the White House and Israel. It's not the same sort of lovey-dovey we're all in for you no matter what, till death do us part, all this stuff, Sam. There is friction because there's political fallout from the last 6 months. And I even think it's being felt at the highest levels of the Democratic Party establishment. What do you think? Is there a potential for a change in the relationship at all, or at least a little bit more restraint from the
Right.
U.S. on Israel?
Yeah, but I mean, it could also be simple posturing for electoral reasons by the Biden administration. I mean, they certainly haven't changed their policy in terms of arming Israel, in terms of um, effectively giving it, political cover. They did allow the one finally a ceasefire resolution to go through at the Security Council by abstaining, but then they immediately undermined it by saying it was non-binding, which is ridiculous. Um, so in terms of core policy, there has not been a change. So, I mean, I always distinguish between, actual show me what you do. I don't care what you say, if it's just simply rhetorical posturing. And, ultimately Israel, you know, I mean, one could see a scenario whereby they put somebody else in who's more palatable than Netanyahu and effectively continue the same policy, someone who's not so brazenly obnoxious. Um, but on the other hand, how else does this stop other than as a first step, Netanyahu leaving? Um, so there are different ways of looking at it, but I ultimately I would say, show me what you're doing. Don't I don't care what you're what you're saying, or what you read in the New York Times about how angry Biden is, or whatever it is.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's scope for. I wish, Sam, the UN Security Council would have a emergency meeting. I mean, if reports are correct, Sam, communiques between the Iranians and the Americans suggest that a condemnation by the UN Security Council against Israel for destroying an Iranian embassy in Damascus, that would go a long way to de-escalation and have high political value for Iran and for its allies. That
Yeah.
seems to be that's the easiest solution to de-escalation, Sam, but I'm not seeing it. And this is the problem. Is there anybody on the Security Council that can make this happen?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a really important way to deal with this. And there are really interesting historical analogies to stuff like that. Um, for example, few people noted when South Africa filed their, case before the ICJ on the Genocide Convention, Hamas stopped firing towards Tel Aviv for a
Very
month
good point.
until the hearings were done. Um, and then the order was given, and then Israel violated the order, and then Hamas resumed striking towards Tel Aviv, like that day or the next day. It was really remarkable. You also had the case, I don't want to go too far in a rabbit hole with you, but this is a fascinating case where during the Iran hostage crisis back in 1979, Senator James Aberesk, who's probably the most radical senator in U.S. history, at least since World War II, Arab American. He attempted to broker a deal whereby the Senate would announce that it would be having hearings about Iranian grievances towards the United States, backing of the Shah, torture that took place under the Shah, all of these nefarious U.S. activities that happened for decades. And then in return, it was a three-step process, and then the Iranians would release the hostages, and then the hearings would be held. And Iran said, if you do that, we can find a diplomatic, if we are able to communicate, if we are able to air these grievances, we can resolve this in a reasonable fashion. And that didn't happen. So instead you had the, insane skullduggery of the October surprise, where you had the Reaganites go behind everybody's back and make a deal and hold the hostages until the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Let's have an open process that gets us peace. and not a deranged. And to his shame, Carter turned down that deal. Ebrest tried to get it done. He was a very influential senator in his own, real maverick sort of way. But the Carter administration stopped it from getting done because they were trying to, be tough and all of this nonsense. Well, it ended up costing Carter the presidency. Thank you very much.
Well, now that you brought this up, Sam, this set of circumstances of the Carter administration, the state of the U.S. economy, the state of the foreign policy predicaments at the time, the type of electoral contest, the contrast, there are some similarities right now today. And what's to say, Sam, that would Donald Trump be in a position to pull some similar sort of stunt that Reagan did at that time, something to do with this current hostilities? Because wouldn't the one Biden or Trump to appear to be the peacemaker to diffuse the escalation to a wider conflict would be, huge amount of kudos in terms of, campaigning there. I wouldn't rule out Biden looking at the hawkishness of Trump on this issue and then maybe holding back a solution to present to the public and diffusing it, and then thus getting a whole wave of support. But it's hugely risky, of course. Do you see similarities between the 80 election and now?
It's possible, and I hadn't thought of it until you said it, but that's really fascinating. I mean, in the context of 1980, you had Bush, who had been CIA director, as his running mate, and all kinds of apparatchiks around his circles, including Bill Casey, who would become CIA director. So he had a lot of mechanisms for doing that kind of skullduggery. Whether Trump has that in his immediate circus, I mean, it's possible. I mean, you could have Kushner, go and talk to some buddies in the Gulf who would have some contacts potentially. I certainly, in terms of ethics, I certainly wouldn't put anything past the cadre around Trump. That's for sure.
Yeah. There's some possibilities there. There's some possibilities there, and likewise on the Biden side, that he could engineer some sort of a similar outcome for the incumbent. I think this is all definitely up for grabs at the moment. The bottom line, of course, for all of us here out in the world is we want to do everything possible to avert World War III, least of all the people in the Middle East who are going to be bearing the brunt of that conflict initially anyway. But moving on, just got a couple of minutes left, and we're going to break in a couple of minutes, Sammy. But what about the ICJ case, Nicaragua v. Germany? All reports indications are it's not looking good for Germany. This is a potential public relations disaster for Germany, for Olaf Scholz. What do you know so far on how this is going to flesh out?
Sure. And we should emphasize that this case happened early this week, and that the speculation around Iran limited the coverage of this. And the crux of the case was that not only, as South Africa has accused, is Israel committing genocide, but that Germany, in parentheses, and other states are aiding and abetting it and are themselves in violation of their treaty obligations under the Genocide Convention. So Nicaragua put forward, it wasn't quite as polished, you might say, as the South Africa case, but it was still a very, very substantial case that Nicaragua put forward, drawing attention to Germany arming Israel and their treaty obligations under the Genocide Convention, and so on and so forth. It was a very robust case. Germany, in its response, basically said, it has been, one of our core reasons of state has been to support Israel because of the Holocaust. This is an insane statement. It has nothing to do with international law. It has nothing to do. It's actually antithetical to international law. The phrase that they used is just raison, not, it's not raison d'etre, it's raison d'etre, if I'm pronouncing it right, which I'm probably not, is basically just saying, we're doing this for political reasons. Usually interpreted as for reasons of state in terms of one's self-interest, but they're saying, no, we're doing this for the interest of Israel. And they went through their litany of that their own domestic laws, prohibit, arming a state that would use it illegally, as if that counts for anything. And they also try to argue that this case from World War II involving a dispute over gold between Italy and Albania was relevant because the relevant country wasn't party to the case, meaning Israel's not a party to this case, and therefore, just sort of on technical grounds. That probably will not hold up because there's a pending case with Israel, and again, Germany is a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and it has agreed that the ICJ can adjudicate disputes in that, and that's exactly what's going on here. They are aiding and abetting genocide, and they are obviously failing to prevent genocide. And so Nicaragua has a strong case.
So would that, in effect, be a precedent for all the other stakeholders who've been arming Israel, the United States included? If this goes that way, does that open the door for more legislation, more legal action?
It could. The problem with the United States is that the U.S. has a reservation on Article 9 of the Genocide Convention, which allows for it to be adjudicated by the ICJ. Now, I don't know what happens if you get a ruling from the ICJ in this case, if that then begins to trump that reservation by the United States. So again, we're pushing the envelope here. You have not seen a case like this actually adjudicated before the ICJ. It has been threatened before in the case of Bosnia, but has not actually gone forward before.
Well, this is very interesting indeed, and quite amazing. Again, a smaller country from the so-called global South running point on this effort, certainly showing up everybody else in the Northern Hemisphere. So listen, we'll keep an eye on this, of course. And again, we appreciate your observations, your insights on these really important stories. Sam Husseini, independent journalist, also independent correspondent at the U.S. State Department. Really appreciate all of your hard work. And do visit Sam Husseini's Substack, subscribe. Excellent journalism there. He'll keep you up to date on what's important going on in Washington. Sam, really appreciate you joining us.
Great to be with you. Thank you, Patrick.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Sam Husseini. Let's take a break right now with TNT, today's news talk. And when we come back, we will close out the news roundup for the week here on Friday. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Stick around. We'll be back in just a few minutes.